Hello everyone, today we talk about the shrewd political exploitation of the evangelizing missions by the pagan leaders of Central, Eastern and Southern Europe during the 9th and 10th centuries. It's a mechanism that we already hinted at often, but that is quite beautifully embodied by these three figures. Could find others, but their action is surely exemplificative. There are Rastislav, Duke of Moravia, the Kniaz of Bulgaria, Boris, Michael the First, and the Princess of the Kievan Rus, Olga. As we will see, the respective contexts are different, and so we will hopefully also dig a bit more into them at some point soon. But they could successfully control and manage and think also internationally the conversion of their own states that were emerging at this point as important players, in fact, in Europe, and how this not only just brought to the conversion itself, but how it allowed these same polities to maintain and increase their own autonomy, which at the beginning was not to be given for granted, because it's exactly through the foundation also of an ecclesiastical administration that the lay political powers could consolidate further, right? And so there was an important internal struggle with the nobility that tendentially had more disgregative, say, centrifugal pushes in a pagan sense, at least until they had the opportunity to rise themselves to the monarchy, in case they supported, of course, the Christianization and the broader international direction that Europe was taking at that point, and also, however, the threat that by a certain extent Christianization itself represented for the same autonomy, if not at some point even the independence. As we will see, this thing is varied, but it's still somewhat present always at the same time of the same polities, right? So Europe between the 9th and the 10th century is first of all in a quite delicate moment. We've seen how, from a strictly narrowly Western perspective, of course, it's a moment of crisis, right? The disgregation of the Carolingian Empire, the second invasions by the Normans, the Magyars, and the Saracens. So at the same time, however, it's a moment of expansion, especially from the within, right, and of stabilization, in fact, of other polities that lived somewhat in the surroundings, say, and that were striving, in fact, to align themselves to the major powers at the time to gain the aforementioned power was necessary, even just to cement their existence, given that some of them also had pretty volatile boundaries at some point. Think about Moravia, that in a sense was, as we will see now, Rastislav was the heir of important, already an important political tradition in an area that would have been eventually hegemonized by Bohemia later on, but that was going up and down. In many ways, the same Bulgaria was coalescing in the Balkans, always, let's say, threatened by the same, and threatening Constantinople at the same time. The Kievan Rus that had been just recently established and that was interacting with Constantinople in ways that could be first enmity, then cooperation, but still a cooperation that, as we will see with Olga, would still be able to look west. So with a very overlooked connection that the Rus had before the Mongol invasions, that of course happened much later than this point, but still with the West, and how similar it was, especially at that point, and how the old Rus lands would remain much closer, in fact, to the West than the later Muscovy and Tsarist Empire really would, right, culturally speaking. and in perspective. So let's say that first of all, there was a competition that never died out, even during the second invasions, between Rome and Constantinople. We've seen it very often. It was at this point the same church, essentially, same universal one. The schism had not happened yet. There had been very harsh conflicts, say, between the two seas, but fundamentally, at least on a formal level, they were acting within the same empire, except a new empire had been formed in the West, and even in that regard, of course, aside from the say legalistic perplexities, especially from Constantinople, the empire was considered as one traditionally, as the imperium is universal, right? Just as the church, in a way. So the competition between Rome and Constantinople happened on different levels, right? They were strictly, say, lay in a sense, or secular if you prefer, and properly spiritual, right? And it was fueled, in fact, by the same, fueled and stimulated by the same uncertain behavior of those princes, of those same princes that from polytheism were orienting towards Christianity. Because, of course, Christianization wasn't immediate, right? Not much, again, for cultural resistance per se, because the polities already existed, right? So if there was any internal reaction, it was, in fact, more against the local power than towards a church somewhere. Like the Byzantines didn't go in arms to Moravia or Khazaria to subdue and impose forced conversions, right? Also the Franks, that were definitely supported by the papacy in their forced evangelization, well, achieved that with the Saxons, but also for reasons that were just inherent politically to the fact that the Saxons had been harassing for centuries the Rhine Valley, and that, you know, they had to cut with it. And as we will see, especially in the Western Slavs, the peoples east of the Elbe, at this point were difficult to subdue, right? They were different from other polities that had been absorbed in the West, and would require an important struggle and an important also overstretching of the Frankish supply lines, etc. It was not really a center to subdue, right? This had already been the problem of the Romans, etc. Peoples that were just not ready yet to be fully integrated. And naturally, Christianity represented a very important step that thus those princes managed to gradually enact, right, also to preserve part of their own power, right? They were easily both pagan and Christian at the same time, which is much more common than we think, even properly in the practice of the mindset of the time, because not just because paganism especially has no problem with adopting Christianity next to the other beliefs, but properly the same Christian beliefs are just, especially in the way they were eventually provided with to this pagan peoples, kind of basically the same message. Paradoxically, you would be surprised to, and how close, and how we haven't properly understood even at some point, at some high levels of historiography, how Christianity, especially in the West, was overloaded with military and glorious symbolism, right? That was also that stemmed philosophically from the same concept, right? It was just seen from a different perspective, but fundamentally was the same thing. This is a completely different thing today. We do not talk. I mean, it was easier than you think to adopt Christianity on the ground of properly of the doctrinal ones. That surely also these peoples didn't have really much else to challenge, because they were not, I don't know, involved in theology or anything. There was if anything, a risk maybe that they would get Christianity in a superficial, if not properly heterodox way, so that these missions were quite important also because in reinforcing the connection with the Mediterranean seas, that had maintained a legacy of great culture and tradition, and could exercise an important control properly on the ideas that were spread and the forms as well, that had all a political meaning, because the point was winning these people to their own side, if we speak in fact of the competition between Rome and Constantinople, and with them providing these peoples with a subtle structure, with an administration, right, with a written tradition, with functionaries, with something that would bring them to the next stage of civilization, kind of playing, interestingly, also not just, and this is especially the case of Rome, on a spiritual level, but also, in fact, on a secular one, right? This would be especially evident by the end, like 1 century afterward, by the end of the 10th and beginning of the 11th century, when the Church was also starting properly the Church of Rome was starting to develop those tools that would have allowed properly a papal monarchy to develop in a universal breadth of properly political vision, right, that began to see the conversion of the Poles, of the Hungarians, also in a way to counter partially the same Germanic Empire for themselves, right, and which is also part of the reason why those peoples converted, right? This is also true for Denmark, etc. That's yet another mechanism, but it a bit stemmed from the same perspective, right? After all these peoples in Europe had converted at some point, right? Even the Franks and the same Romans, etc. So from the differences is also easier to understand the mechanisms through which they happen and how and why at the time and in those places that it happened. So the suggestion exercised by the Christian missionaries on this still pagan princes who surely knew Christianity. We don't know. Even, for example, Rastislav, that had probably been raised as a hostage at the Carolingian court, was already Christian before the official baptism in Moravia, etc. So Christianity was spreading anyway, right? It was in the air. There were already Christians in these countries, but the important was to officialize the conversion of the establishment, right? So, let's say, was a suggestion that didn't hide, let's say, from them, from such missions, the dangers of an incorporation of the local people in religious frames were strictly connected with political powers of vast ambitions, right? Part how these powers came to play with the bigger ones, with the universal ones, such as in fact the Byzantine Empire and the Carolingian one, were facilitated by the same 10th century crisis, right? If those collapses had not temporarily occurred, right? If, say, the Carolingians or the Byzantines had just entered in a phase of prolonged expansionism, had they consolidated their system, probably it would have been more difficult to convert these peoples. They would have made like a greater block and resistance against this expansionism. But paradoxically, it's exactly because those greater powers were in trouble that these smaller ones understood that by joining their model, they would have benefited at that point as states, right? Even though they didn't really, well, in some cases, yes. I mean, speaking especially of the Western Slavs, they maybe participated to the Magyar raids, etc. Also, the Rus were always kind of in initially intense relations with Constantinople, and even the Bulgars, later properly the Bulgarians, were always kind of a threat for Constantinople. But the Christianizing direction for these people specifically was not like it wouldn't seem irreversible, right? Or it wouldn't even seem already, a matter of choice, especially because they were, as powers that were already emerging, already stabilizing, right? And so these weren't in fact the Vikings or the Magyars or well, the Saracens were probably mostly part of another monotheism, but let's say the aforementioned pagans were somewhat less living in the traditional tribal fashion, raiding, etc. These other powers were instead consolidating importantly, and so they necessitated any way of some sort of greater order that the church could provide, also to back the force of the monarchy, of the princes. But surely albeit weakened, the universal empires could exercise an important control on these powers too through the same Christianization. The loss of religious autonomy threatened also the ethnic political identity of the new peoples, because of course this had been traditionally pagan, and so great part of their the mechanisms that had kept the clans, the confederacies together, was based, of course, on a type of sacrality was different, at least in form, in rite, from the Christian one. It was seen as an external imposition because it had its own liturgy, it had a tradition of its own that came from other peoples, right? So as I was saying before, it wasn't even a matter of of the contents per se. After all, the sacralities were stressing the divinity of royalty, right? The importance of struggle, of properly also of martyrdom, this idea of the holy war that was actually at the center of all of the pagan ideology. So it was again a matter of would be to dictate those forms, and that meant political control from their side. And religious autonomy also was important within the country because having an autocephalous church was, especially in Bulgaria, a problem of great relevance because they were just next door to Constantinople, so they were unavoidably influenced by it, and even a greater influence could have been detrimental for the same political unit of the country. And as we will see, Boris will be able to exploit it very well. Whereas if you converted, let's say, Moravia or Russia, well, at that point, yeah, they could fall within the orbit, respectively, of the Carolingians or the Byzantines. But let's say, as far as the church was concerned, it was still something that just for the distance could be managed in relative autonomy. Now, in the 9th century, in front of the missionary zeal exercised by the Patriarch of Aquileia, and especially by the Metropolite of Salzburg, that was the episcopal see in the territory of the Bavarians, today in Austria, and elevated to the metropolitic level by will of Charlemagne himself, for all another reason we'll explain in a while. The Moravian prince, Rastislav, provoked the mission from Constantinople of the famous Methodius and of Constantine Cyrillus. This is particularly relevant because as we've seen, for example, in the videos we made recently about medieval Bavaria and medieval Austria, these areas of the upper Danube had been restored or just provided with for the first time with a remarkable political and strategical stability by the Franks that had in part also stripped them away from the Avars that traditionally had been the power that had hegemonized policy also in peoples like the ones of Moravia and other surrounding countries. So the Avars, interestingly enough, of course, were still pagan at the moment of their demise. Of course, a different type of paganism from the one of, say, of the Slavs, that had surely some commixture at that point, but that was still not organized, right, in a, say, in a religious administration of some sort. It was something more primitive, as also probably the crumbling of the softened up Khaganate at that point showed, right? Instead, the Franks were coming up in arms. They were looking for new land to seize, to conquer, to subdue, and the establishment of a metropolitic see in the area of the Upper Danube meant really, these people are here to stay, right? And the surrounding ones, largely pagan in the northeast, etc., this area of Moravia, would have had to deal with a permanent power, would try not just to subdue them politically or militarily, but also to convert them, right? So it was all one, right? And Charlemagne had really a great care for Bavaria, that effectively in the late Carolingian era in Eastern Francia was the center of power, right? The Eastern Frankish court was in Regensburg, so not far actually from the areas of Bohemia, Moravia, etc. And in fact, Rastislav had, as we were saying before, probably been an hostage at Carolingian court, and was installed in Moravia. We don't know exactly what connection was with the previous ruler. It was part of the same family for sure, but say the sources are relatively vague. The important thing is that he would have had to eventually act as a pawn of the Carolingians. But Moravia was also provided with an important autonomy and identity already, and so actually warfare broke out between the Franks and the Moravians. And at that point, probably, Rastislav thought well to ask. The Moravians were still pagan altogether. There hadn't been an official conversion, or even if when it actually happened individually for the prince, it necessarily didn't happen for the rest of the people. Rastislav sent a delegation to Rome to organize the conversion of the Moravians, which for some reason, which I think we don't know, was rejected. I think it may have been because the Franks were at that point trying to at least to control the area more directly, and they already knew that what you convert the Moravians for, that eventually you can't even wage war against them. You have to first subdue them, right? So the Pope refused, and this is what brought eventually to the famous mission of Methodius and Cyrillus from Constantinople, because Rastislav said, okay, you don't want us to get converted. It would have been a form of shelter from Frankish expansionism. We will ask Constantinople. Consider that at this time, as I was saying before, later on, like in the 10th century, the Western Slavs would importantly participate also to the Magyar raids into Eastern Francia. Right at this point, the Magyars had not migrated yet in the Pannonian Basin, so this was a moment where literally there was no other major power in between them and the Franks. Basically, the Carolingian and the Bulgarian Empire bordered the Moravia would have at some point some capacity later to expand even up to the Danube, the Middle Danube, namely very unstable domination. But still, Moravia, as we've seen, was more than just again a set of clans, right? It was compact into something more consistent, and that's why probably the Franks couldn't tolerate kind of an autonomous religious policy, and even more when properly entering a very dangerous game. It was going on also with Bulgaria, right? Because the mechanisms for which the Moravians, the Bulgarians would interact also with the Carolingians depended on the efforts of Constantinople to evangelize these peoples and to prevent their Christianization at the hands of Rome. So it was an extremely complicated thing, made even more complicated just by the general political instability. But the First Bulgarian Empire at this point was also really a power to be reckoned with. So there are a lot of interesting mechanisms going on. And Rastislav would keep fighting essentially with the Eastern Franks until he was defeated. Finally, he was basically blinded and closed in the monastery. It's a general Frankish practice for political opponents. And he was succeeded by a relative of his. It was Svatopluk of Moravia. It also was, in fact, a very important ruler. It would bring Moravia to unprecedented heights, let's say. But Wu, as essentially and initially as a Frankish pawn, essentially destroyed the Byzantine churches. He expelled the disciples of Cyril and Methodius and established instead a Roman church in Moravia. It was also there to stay, right? This is quite interesting. Also because we have letters from the Metropolitic See of Salzburg that was complaining of Rastislav's decision to convert with the Byzantine Rite, because that was creating a break within the same Christian community there, because they were taking sides and they were kind of essentially not recognizing each other on the base of such political interest, right? So it would take a long time before also the areas of Bohemia and Moravia would be fully incorporated, as you know, in the Holy Roman Empire. And let's say the Moravian Bohemian region is actually a great success of Christianization in the Middle Ages, etc. But this is just for saying how complex and brutal also in the internal policy of the country such competition could be, right? So there's really a sign of destruction of the older Byzantine buildings, right? Fruit of the mission, etc. And this is all the more relevant considering that the guys that were expelled from Moravia by Svatopluk in a pro-Roman fashion would bring to one of the most influential cultural dynamics in Slavic history, because their Glagolitic that had been created properly as a script for adapting it to the Slavonic language that was also brought by Methodius and Constantine in Rome, where they were coming back from Moravia, and the Pope wanted to check it and confirm that it was well translated, because they feared some heresy could spread at that point, and had masses sung in Slavonic all over the Roman churches. It's kind of very nice thing if you think about it in European history. And naturally there was a political move in that too, because the church was still one, and if the Pope welcomed Methodius and Cyrillus, he was essentially proposing himself also in front of the Central European peoples that had been just converted, that so themselves being welcomed in Rome as well, and so trying to take them away more from Constantinople, which is factually with Svatopluk, the Carolingians, the papacy, what factually happened, so that the area would remain, as you know, historically Catholic in at least before the Reformation. So this had an important impact also for Constantinople. It was an area where the Romans won, as the one in Croatia, for example, etc. Bulgaria received the Moravian refugees after Sviatopluk's expansion. Right, at the time, the Kniaz, that is the Prince of Bulgaria, was Boris the First. When the Byzantine evangelization of the Bulgarians was already undergoing, unavoidably, the Bulgars had settled, as you know, in this, in fact, the area of Thrace, had importantly supported by local Slavic tribes, and had always remained kind of like Damocles' sword just next door to Constantinople. And with this typically steppe overlord's mindset of ecumenic ambition, for which they thought themselves to be peers, if not superiors, properly to the Byzantines, and wanting to share imperial power with them. This would naturally have to pass gradually by osmosis through the creation of a church that at this point was one of the greatest hopes for Constantinople to try to subdue the Bulgarians. And, there were many wars going on for centuries, as you know, up to Basil II, at least up to the end of the so-called First Bulgarian Empire, to trying to get rid properly of the Bulgarians, which finally succeeded in a way. But in this process, the Byzantines hoped that by converting the Bulgarians and by imposing them their Greek rite and script, they would manage essentially to assimilate them better and to eventually dilute them into the imperial territory in some way. This was a big issue for Boris because the nobility was not adverse to Christianization per se, right? It was surely there was a faction that surely backed quite strongly the pagan tradition, also in an anti-monarchic sense, to maintain the prerogatives of the nobility. So this kind of autonomy, but it was understood that especially against such a powerful neighbor like Constantinople, some greater cohesion had to occur also on an ideological base. But if the Bulgarian church had spoken and written Greek, this would have unavoidably been seen as an alien interference, even essentially by those Bulgarians who were okay with the conversion to Christianity. So this was a reason why Boris thought well to support the further spread of Glagolitic, and actually a version of it that would have probably been the Cyrillic that we know, and that from Bulgaria spread all over essentially the almost all the Slavic countries in Eastern Europe to become the standard script, in fact, till this day. Right, it was a variant that it could have occurred just in Moravia, right, if the Byzantine missionaries had not been expelled, right. Instead, Bulgaria would capitanate it, and Boris achieved this. How? There was an option, there was an opportunity. That was the relation with the Roman Pope, that for a long time, and depending on the various swings in Bulgarian policy because of military reversals, relations with the Carolingians, the Moravians, the Serbs, etc., and that where these frontiers were swinging, right? Boris suffered important military setbacks at the same time, but is considered as a great diplomat, right? As a great politician, a skilled connoisseur of international policy. Well, by using this threat of the conversion under the Roman rite that Constantinople saw as probably one of the greatest problems, because not just they would have had a Bulgarian neighbor reinforced by the creation of a church they could have not controlled, but it was in turn controlled by their major opponents, that is the popes in Rome, and indirectly by the Carolingians in part. Granted quickly right, Constantinople granted quickly, the um, the Bulgarian liturgy to be carried out in a Slavic language rather than Greek. Right. Finally, there was a time in which Boris could and would convert um, through the Roman ambassadors, but let's say it was it could happen, say that the political alignment didn't eventually occur. It was in many ways easier to um, to just fall in the Greek sphere, because even just culturally, just imagine what would have happened, right, if Bulgaria had Latin just as a language, and they would have had the major cultural power next door pressing for Greek, and being still a Slavic speaking people. It would have been probably source of further fragmentation by a certain degree and complication. Fortunately for Bulgaria, did not happen. But this was also the threat, thanks to which Boris, threat for the Byzantines, thanks to which Boris could obtain the Bulgarian church to be Slavic in language and in script, which for the Bulgarian nation was a big deal, also for the same development of the Bulgarian state further. And speaking of Olga of Kyiv, so the regent, princess of the Varangian state that had formed along the great Russian rivers, and particularly the Dnieper, with an important military elan and strategic projection capacity, also trade development, and therefore resource availability, had been baptized in the mid-10th century according to the Byzantine rite. So there is a story of Olga that is quite picturesque. It's very mythological in many ways. When she essentially was the widow of Igor, son of Rurik, so the founder probably of the Rurikid dynasty that stemmed from essentially this Viking chieftain that had first harassed the Franks in the west and gone in Eastern Europe, and her husband had died in a military expedition against neighboring people that Olga was eventually credited for subduing with atrocious cruelty in revenge for her husband's assassination. There's all these anecdotes that are very interesting to read, and also the one about the conversion when she went to Constantinople. And this is interesting because eventually it would be her grandson Vladimir that would convert the Rus and also became a saint in the process, etc. But she had probably gone to Constantinople to get baptized, and the story is quite anecdotal. She passed in the sources for this beautiful and intelligent woman who offered to convert herself to Christianity at the condition she would have been baptized essentially by the emperor, by the patriarch, but as the emperor as godfather. And the emperor was actually married. In fact, his wife was named Helena, and Olga is said to have been eventually named Helena in the baptism. The story goes anecdotally because the emperor would have liked to marry her, and this is not true. But it just speaks of the trick in the story that she would like to that she managed to play on the emperor by showing probably what was already an awareness from her of Christianity. In fact, she was baptized, and after baptism, the emperor asked her to marry him because he had already done it. But she said, I'm still a pagan, we can't get married, so I will convert only if you are my godfather. And the emperor asked again to marry her, and she said, Emperor, you don't know that, you're my spiritual father now, you cannot marry me according to the Christian law. Of course, this is a completely invented story, because, but it still shows the caliber of the woman in the tradition, in the historiography, or at the time. And what is interesting, in fact, is that she converted, and the Rus didn't. They wouldn't. They would do it just in 2 generations. It was early enough, but probably this princess had realized very well that the Rus needed, in order for a prince to rule such ecclesiastical order and control. It's a matter of authority, of discipline, right? Or something that speaks of a universal language of what ecumenic rulers should be made of, fundamentally. And eventually, Olga came back to the Rus, and after a while, she contacted the German king Otto I. Why? Because she wanted a bishop from the West. That would have had probably to establish an episcopate in Kyiv. Now, eventually, this would fail. We don't really know what happened. But there is an hypothesis, because what we know is that the Germans actually sent a delegation with the would-be bishop and all, right? And this is quite interesting because, again, Olga, just like you see, this is the leitmotif of all these 3 princesses, that they all played with Rome and Constantinople alike, right? What Olga probably had envisaged was the advantage that would derive by exploiting the competition of Rome and Constantinople. Also for the evangelization of the Rus. She had been converted in Constantinople, but she asked essentially a Western bishop to convert the people. When this delegation arrived to Kyiv, however, nothing was to be done. And it's been hypothesized, and it's probably correct, that had been a major establishment change due to an attempted coup or political shift enacted by the pagan fringe of the nobility, who did not want to be Christianized, and that had prevented Olga from carrying out successfully this international machination for her country. We're not well documented, unfortunately, on the time and place, but we can see probably there a dynamic of this kind that, in fact, highlights also for the Rus the possibility of remaining in contact properly with multiple powers at the time to derive for its own country the let's say a degree of religious autonomy, right? That would emerge from a mix of the two Roman and Constantinopolitan sides. And I would add that, especially in the case of the Rus, that was kind of newer in the game and kind of more distant from the Mediterranean world in general, and to mix the both influences, right? For Moravia, it would have been, as we've seen, a much more brutal field choice that would bring literally to an internal civil war to destroy what the Constantinopolitan mission had achieved, and to substitute it with the Roman one. As for Boris in Bulgaria, he played it very shrewdly, and he knew probably there weren't many options to realistically, but the Byzantine conversion, but still the Roman influence was very strong, right? It was strong also properly in the Balkans at that point. The Croatians were won over, right? And those were also incidentally kind of in competition with the Bulgarian Empire, interestingly enough. So in the various cases, the attraction of the close ecclesiastical centers ended up to prevail, as you understand. Moravia would be incorporated in the Western Empire on the long run. If you look at the Serbs as well, their direction was unavoidably Byzantine. They were more projected towards the Balkan hinterland, and just also because of the Magyar power they would establish in the north, to which they were more exposed compared to Constantinople, from which they were in a more decentralized position. They would choose and strengthen the Byzantine field, also through the Danube. Frankly, the Serbs kept receiving an important Eastern influence, especially from the Rus. That is evidence also in material culture and equipment. Like the Serbs and the Croats were basically the same people. They looked very differently on the battlefield, for example. In part, I mean, very differently is a big word, but generally speaking, the Croats eventually gravitate towards the Roman Germanic side, and the Serbs towards the Byzantine Orthodox one. And it was obvious, right? It's not here, as we were saying, especially about Boris, a matter of saying, what would have happened, really. It was how they would play the game rather than what would happen in the end. Because in the end, the history of Europe was the history of Christianization. It was at no time a force here that was able to escape that properly, even in potential, nor one that had really, the let's say the point of escaping the influence of the major political power that would orbit into, right? It's just like eventually Hungary, Poland, they would obviously kind of fall in the Western area. Even if Hungary had a lot of Byzantine influence too, still the Lagerfeld changed that, right, in perspective. There have been other major shifts historically, even in times where Constantinople, frankly, didn't count as much as before, at least as an empire. We're talking about the conversion of the Lithuanians later on in history, in the 14th century, and that's a bit an exception in the greater distance in the northeast of Europe. And even there, the Lithuanians had remained pagan just for broader political reasons, not much because of a particular aversion to Christianity per se, so much that they actually chose eventually autonomously the Christianity. They had already been seeking relations with the papacy, etc. But there was a point at which they could convert to Orthodoxy. They could have created a Lithuanian Muscovite commonwealth rather than a Polish-Lithuanian one. But eventually they stuck to Catholicism even there, because Poland was the major political power in the area that they needed also to shelter themselves from the Teutonics. So you see a bit the same mechanism, also from a secular point of view of previous eras, and so we know how it went. But that was a major shift, was a major change, because even in there, Lithuanians had married into the Russian nobility, etc. So there was a time which it seemed as if they would have almost passed from, the Orthodox side instead. But those were very different times. The schism had already occurred. Europe was a much more complicated thing. Anyhow, and all these changes, however, brought with them important political consequences. In the case of the Bulgarians, for example, whose princes were literally taken by the mirage of Constantinople. They were aspiring to the Basileus dignity, and it was frankly in their own interest. On the long run, they lost because probably they didn't have enough. Let's say that their background was not solid enough as the millenary Byzantine one. It was probably another world in a way. So this shows also, this is a bit the history of Central Eastern Europe, that you can have powers that can rise to an important level even very quickly, but that at some point can even maintain a greater extensional continuity, maybe with some other powers that can fragment it at some time. Think about the West with the Carolingians and feudalism and the local lords that autonomize themselves. But that on the longer run, they can maintain that level just because internally they don't have many other option. Because if they would fragment, they would simply also disappear. So they had to stick together, but without much greater gluing capacity on the long run. So that's how Basil II in the long run managed to tame the Bulgarians, albeit they always kind of loomed in the Balkans, because those weren't really areas that by high medieval times you could really, ethnically eradicate, right? And so in fact the Second Bulgarian Empire would occur. Paradoxically and indirectly, the same Second Bulgarian Empire would save Constantinople from annihilation much before 1453. Another people who was quite affected by these mechanisms were the Slovenians that had established power on their own, the so-called Carantania, that however was absorbed first by the Carolingians, eventually by the renewed Teutonic power at the time of the Ottonians, after the Magyars had been resized in power. An area would be, in fact, importantly also Germanized culturally next to the Slavic majority. Also, we mentioned the Croats before, that were first oriented towards the Carolingians, then for a while tried to escape Frankish pressure. They turned a little bit towards Constantinople, but fundamentally stuck to the western orbit, and by the 11th century they formally became vassals of the Church of Rome, the time of Gregory VII, so properly during the rise of the papal monarchy. And as we were saying also before, the particular historical effectiveness up to the modern age of the Moravian Bohemian area that was firmly established, not just in the Catholic area, but also properly within the Holy Roman Empire, right? And would in fact westernize more quickly and remain unequivocally and without afterthoughts a Roman Catholic entity. And I think it's very interesting to observe this dynamics, because they explain better and better how also the process of evangelization first of all went, but in general properly what this was concretely about, right? It was the possibility of entering a bigger circuit for the local elite to become more powerful, to establish a more stable polity, to exercise a greater authority and control. And all these countries are in fact destined towards a history of historical unity that was reinforced by the cultural homogeneity provided also by by religion. That you would be surprised by the fact it could be maybe the greatest gluing force, especially in certain areas. You think about the Rus, right? It's very extended, very diverse within itself. Well, the Christian identity, arguably up to this day, was a major, if not the greatest, one among these people, because it's as if these identities had been properly engineered ex novo, right? At least at a level of cohesion that had never been seen before, right? These peoples would previously identify rather with the clan that than with the kingdom, with the principality. And there was nothing kind of greater than that, right? Even the name of the original peoples, the Bulgars, whatever, was just more like an international shout out. But the most important identity was the clanic one. And that often stressed, that existed in, let's say, in that had made up the confederal one, exactly to stress the autonomy of the same clan. This would be even also in Hungary, that for a long time, as you know, would have struggled with its oligarchs, that were somewhat opposing the centralizing monarchic direction that was even there, with a lot of work engineered, especially after Lechfeld and the Christianization, the rise of the Arpads, etc. And that, again, would even fail in the long run, because in great part the systems would remain elective, right, or at least provided with kind of a loose connection among each other. Think about even the Polish Piasts made a video how similar they were to the Rurikid Rus in political practice, right? So even bloodline, the dynastic connection, well, all things that were new in practice to that level of statal construction, right? Because others would have not quite accepted them in the same way. And probably it's not a coincidence also that the church stressed in the historiographical narrative of these nations the central role of these rulers, that in many ways were quite ambiguous. I mean, all of the three of them we have seen here were surely, they still believed in paganism as much as in Christianity, because it was completely easy, normal and extremely easy to do. And they truly believed, probably these people believed in Christianity way more intensely than modern Christians, albeit being pagans at the same time. And this is often, in fact, overlooked. And all of three of them, Rastislav of Moravia, Boris of Bulgaria, and Olga of Kyiv, would become saints, right? Especially the latter two in the Orthodox tradition, because Rastislav eventually was to be the country was to be Catholic, so the Roman Church had a different view on these things. But in the Orthodox one, in fact, Boris and Olga were styled to as at the same level of the apostles, right? So they were not apostles, but they had essentially played a role that was factually the same, so they could be venerated as equal to the apostles, literally not as the apostles, but equal to the apostles. It was a way, a bit of Hellenic sophistry there that the Byzantines had maintained. But importantly enough to understand also for these peoples how actually these rulers, exactly because of the power that they had accumulated at the time, also from the pagan national perspective, were, for those who had supported them, really provided with a power, an imperium, right? And the case of Olga, eventually her grandson would also become a saint because he evangelized the Rus, etc. So this is all part of a mythology that catalyzed literally the national coalescence of these peoples, also in a statal sense. Because otherwise, what does make a nation if not the political unity, right? And it's always very interesting to discuss them, and we will come back soon also on these aspects, also from the other side, right? That is to say, how they made it, especially from the Roman side, right? How the missions took place, how the metropolitic sees were organized, how everything was coordinated with the imperial policy, read the military one as well. Yeah, that's pretty much it. So for today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, do a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.